Welcome to COM 4740, Chapter 10, Culture, Communication, and Intercultural Relationships. Let's begin by talking about some benefits and challenges of intercultural relationships. Remember back to the beginning of the semester, I talked about how there isn't a comprehensive set of rules on how to communicate well interculturally. We're not trying to be prescriptive here. Instead, we're trying to develop our interpersonal communication skills with a special awareness of how culture can affect the communication process. In other words, we're becoming more aware of the pitfalls and challenges that might occur when we communicate across culture, and we're trying to adjust for those challenges. Some of the benefits and challenges of intercultural communication are listed here. Remember that the stereotyping process involves making generalizations about groups of people that we don't know personally. When we get to know a member of that group personally, we gain better insights into how members of that group think and interact. This is a great benefit of going to university and interacting across difference with a variety of classmates. Secondly, we can work on seeing conflict as opportunity. It's natural for us as humans to shrink away from disagreement, but as we develop our skills in communicating across difference, we can be brave and curious and see differences as a gateway to further understanding. And then through these relationships, we can acquire new knowledge and life skills. Now let's look at some of the challenges of intercultural relationships. It's hard to get past stereotypes and be willing to engage across difference because we don't like being uncomfortable. We tend to self-segregate and stick with our own kind, whatever we perceive that to be. So it takes mental and emotional effort to intentionally interact with people who we think are different from ourselves. We have to be brave and be willing to be uncomfortable, willing to get it wrong, willing to be embarrassed, because we see the outcome as being more important than our discomfort. And we need to work past our natural inclination to see conflict as destructive and work toward thinking of conflict as an opportunity to engage and to increase our understanding. All of this is hard and it takes work. It can be a lifelong process for most people. Let's examine some dialectics that are particular to intercultural relationships. You might remember that dialectics are opposing forces that push and pull you in two different directions. So you have kind of a conflict in your own mind about opposing things. And we're going to examine some dialectics here. We're going to look at the personal contextual dialectic, the cultural individual, the differences, similarities, the privilege disadvantage, the static dynamic, and the history, past, present, future dialectic. And in the upcoming slides, we'll talk about these one by one. The personal contextual dialectic refers to a situation where we're feeling torn between our personal beliefs or opinions about something and the beliefs and opinions of those in our immediate context. So think of a situation where you have an authentic belief, but it differs from your friend group or your family, and how you might feel torn between expressing yourself authentically and going along with the group. Maybe you're going along with the group because you want to belong, but maybe also because you're just not up for having the conflict or having the discussion. You're not up for expressing that opinion and having any blowback about it, right? So you might feel torn in that way. You might not be as forthcoming with your own thoughts or your authentic self in a situation where you're unsure of the group's approval. And an example given of that here, I find him handsome, but when I see him next to my friends' boyfriends, I struggle with my conditioning about conventional good looks. So maybe this person is doubting whether or not their significant other is attractive because they're doing some social comparison here. Maybe they're afraid that their friend group is not going to find their significant other attractive as they do. And maybe they're just not willing to either face up to that difference yet or to engage with it. So this person in the example, feeling torn between their own authentic feelings, thoughts, and behavior versus what is in the immediate context around them. A similar dialectic is the cultural individual dialectic. This can be described as the influences of our culture code versus the influences of our individual standpoint. So this is somewhat similar to the last one, but it's a little broader. Let me explain. The influences of culture code are the expectations of the broader culture around us, not just our family or friend group, but the major culture we find ourselves immersed in. For example, American culture. Part of our culture code is that you should always want to advance in life, right? We should always be looking to make more money. We should always be looking to have a more important job title. That is part of our culture code. But your individual standpoint, based on a lifetime of experiences and the way you view the world, the way you have been shaped to view the world, might say, you know what, that kind of advancement is not that important to me. As long as I am happy and satisfied in what I'm doing, I don't necessarily care about the higher salary or the more important title. Maybe other things are more important to you, like time for hobbies or time to pursue a second career, something like that. But again, since this is a dialectic, we might feel pushed and pulled between these, right? We know what our culture expects of us. And when we go against that because of our individual standpoint, we might be concerned that we're going to get ridiculed, we're going to get labeled. The person I just described might get labeled as unambitious, something like that. So we might feel torn between adhering to the culture code and working more toward our individual standpoint. An example given here, on an intellectual level, I don't think, fill in the blank, matters that much, but I know it matters on a societal level. So if you feel torn between those things and you feel like you should conform with the societal expectation, again, maybe just because you don't want to get into the conflict or engage in it, that would be an example of this struggle of the cultural individual dialectic. Now let's look at the differences, similarities dialectic, or the feeling that we're being pushed and pulled between wanting similarity and wanting difference with others. The similarity principle tells us that likeness attracts, and we know this in our own lives. We tend to look for our own kind. We look for people who are similar to us. If you walked into a crowded room and took a look around, who would you walk over and engage with? Most likely it would be someone who's similar to you. So this works in terms of physical attraction. It also works in terms of intellectual attraction. As you see the second bullet point here, cognitive consistency. We seek connection through like beliefs and through agreement, right? So we tend to be naturally attracted to likeness. However, too much likeness can be boring and uninteresting. And sometimes we are attracted to difference, but we feel hesitant to engage with it because it's uncomfortable. So that's the push and pull of the differences, similarities dialectic. And what we've been talking about in this class is to find ways to overcome that pull towards similarity and to be willing to step in the direction of difference. So a person might say, I know that difference enriches our relationship, but sometimes I long for more likeness between us. You can feel this way with friends, classmates, all kinds of people where you might wish you had more in common with somebody, or you might be attracted to them because you have nothing in common. We've often had a good friend who is very unlike us, but helps to pull us in the other direction along this dialectic. The privilege-disadvantage dialectic is an interesting one. We've talked about what it means to be privileged within a culture. Generally, if you are a member of the majority culture, if you are educated and healthy and physically attractive and all those kinds of things, it gives you an advantage or privilege over other people within your culture. But no matter how privileged you are in a particular context, you might be disadvantaged in other contexts. And most of us have felt this from time to time, where you might be really privileged in one situation and very much at a disadvantage in another one. So, for example, when I walk into a college classroom as your professor, I'm in a position of privilege there. I am going to go to the front of the room and I'm going to speak and I'm going to expect people to listen to me. All of those things are privilege within that context. But I don't have that same privilege in every other room I walk into. If I walk into a room where nobody knows me, if I walk into a room where I am in the minority in some way, I am no longer privileged. You don't carry your privilege with you. Privilege is always contextual, and that's important to remember. Another example would be, as a white English-speaking American, I am privileged in many ways in my own country. If you drop me in another country where I don't speak the language, I don't know the culture, I don't fit in with the majority, I am not going to be privileged. I am going to be disadvantaged in that setting. So I don't carry my privilege with me. Again, it is always contextual. So think about how power differentials can work in different contexts. In some situations, you might be the most powerful person in the room. In others, you might be the least powerful person in the room. You don't carry that privilege with you. So you're going to feel pushed and pulled between being confident and having privilege versus feeling disadvantaged. And then how do you reckon with that feeling of being disadvantaged? How do you grapple with that feeling of being inadequate in a different setting? The next dialectic we'll look at is the static dynamic dialectic. And remember that static means something that is unchanging. Dynamic means something that is ever-changing. So the static dynamic dialectic refers to aspects of a relationship that don't change versus aspects that do change, and how we feel torn between them. We're comfortable with the familiar, and when it comes to a relationship with somebody else, we're comfortable with their familiar way of being in the world, their way of speaking, their way of thinking. And when they change, it's uncomfortable. When we change, it can be uncomfortable for us and for the other person. So this dialectic describes the conflict between wanting things to remain the same, but also embracing change. And the change part is hard. We tend to be more comfortable on the unchanging or static end of this. An example is given in the quote here. George is a lot of fun, but he was a lot more chill when he was single. We've all seen this kind of thing happen with friends who perhaps they marry and have kids, and their focus in life changes, right? They become more concerned with their spouse and their family than they are with their friend group or their old hobbies or their old ways of being anymore. And their single friends can feel left behind and feel disappointed in the change. We can feel torn between wanting things to be the same and wanting things to change. The history past versus present future dialectic describes the push and pull between staying rooted in our histories and in our past knowledge versus moving forward in different ways. in our thinking and in our experience. So we're describing it as the historical influence on the relationship versus the desire for a more positive future for the relationship. And for a better understanding of this dialectic, I would refer you to the Seeds of Peace Camp video that is in the supplemental videos on e-learning. Again, if you click on the supplemental videos folder on e-learning, you're going to have to click on load more at the bottom of the screen because it goes on to a second screen there, but there is a video called Seeds of Peace Camp video. And the Seeds of Peace Camp is a camp where they bring teens together from places in the world that are in conflict. So for example, they bring Israeli and Palestinian kids together to have facilitated dialogue. And those young people really struggle with this particular dialectic in the video, so it would give you a good visual representation of it. These campers at Seeds of Peace Camp, as they participate in these discussions, are talking a lot about the past and about the historical basis for the conflict, but they're also being encouraged to try to look toward the present and the future in order to be able to move beyond that conflict and to form a different kind of relationship with one another. And even in our daily lives, it's easy for us to get attached to the past history of our relationship, the past history of how that person has acted, and be unable to move beyond that in order to form a new relationship with them. So an example here in the quote at the bottom, campers at Seeds of Peace need to move past their histories and look to the future in order to have better relationships. We can't get rid of that historical foundation, but we can't cling to it with no room for thinking differently, is what this dialectic suggests. Throughout the semester, we've been looking at the social science, interpretive, and critical approaches to different aspects of intercultural communication. So let's start by taking the social science approach to intercultural relationships. Remember that the social science approach always tries to be prescriptive and predictive. So a social scientist would say that success in forming intercultural relationships depends on factors or traits that the person brings to the relationship, such as those listed here. Compatible notions of friendship or romance might be an indicator of possible success. Compatible notions of relationship development stages. In other words, at what point in a relationship do we consider ourselves exclusive? At what point in our relationship might we show public displays of affection? Things like that. And then compatible notions on the importance of privacy and intimacy. A social scientist would say that two people who share these compatible notions have a bigger chance of having a successful intercultural relationship. Recall that the interpretive approach looks more at the individual situation and says that we experience communication in the moment and it's different every time. So the interpretive scholar would say that a relationship achieves a turning point of understanding through self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is how we come closer, not because we bring similar traits into the relationship, but because we share more of ourselves with the other person over time. The interpretive approach would say that context really matters. For example, if this intercultural relationship is taking place at work, then we have power dynamics involved as well. So that context is going to affect the way we relate to each other. And that social change facilitates more intercultural contact. And many of us have seen this at play in our own lives. As the world has become more blended, more integrated, we have had the opportunity for more intercultural contact in the classroom and in the workplace especially. And that increased opportunity has been creating a fertile ground for more intercultural contact. So again, the interpretive approach would say more that everything's contextual, it happens in the moment, relationships unfold between people, and the success of the relationship is not so dependent on the individual traits of each person coming into the relationship, but more on what they develop in interaction with one another. And finally, the critical approach always looks at differences in power and privilege as a possible reason for conflict or difference in general. So the critical scholar would say when you're looking at an intercultural relationship, you need to be aware of and you need to look at those possible differences in power and privilege that might be at play. And here are some examples of that. Family attitudes, which would form a big part of your standpoint. Neighborhood diversity. Where does the person come from? Have they experienced neighborhood diversity in the past? Religious belief. Is religion at play in this cultural difference? What about educational level or political affiliation? What are the power differentials and privilege differentials that might be inherent in some of these differences? That concludes these highlights of Chapter 10. Please read the chapter thoroughly and contact me with any questions. I'll see you in the next one.